Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. If we could get started, please. On behalf of the Academy of Technological Sciences and Engineering, I'd like to welcome you to this symposium after Hazelwood, Victoria's Electricity Future. My name's David Brockway, for those of you that don't know me. This is clearly a very timely symposium with the national attention on the cost of supply, on the the security of supply, the cost of electricity, and the need to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions from our energy sector, particularly electricity. It's obviously an enormous topic, and in the time available, we will attempt to examine some of the major challenges and some of the possible solutions to production, transmission, distribution, storage and demand management. But clearly governments have been wrestling with this, as have companies, for some years, so there's a limited amount to which we can cover in one day. We'll do the best we can. We'll do so in the context of the national electricity market, also in the context of industry and community expectations and potential electricity prices in coming years. Of course, the electricity price is a key issue at the moment. We will not, unless there's a particularly brave presenter, offer solutions to the expected tight supply over the coming summer. If one of our speakers is prepared to do so, we would welcome the opportunity to hear it. There's a few housekeeping matters before we get into the program. There have been a couple of late withdrawals of speakers. Andy Vasey of AGL and Glenn Platt of CSIRO are not available, and Professor Pierluigi Mansarella will be replaced by Professor Ivan Mariels. These have necessitated a couple of changes to the program that was sent out previously, and you will have seen on the web. So there is a new program in your brochure. The principal change is that we will bring the two papers from session 3 forward before lunch, so that we'll balance more or less the time between the morning and afternoon sessions, and there is a clear break in session 3 between those two papers and the subsequent renewable papers as well. We have a tight program, and I would request that speakers stick as closely as possible to the allocated time, please. For those of you that aren't aware of it, we are actually podcasting this symposium to ATSE fellows in other states, and at times in the question time, fellows from interstate may be asking questions, and they will be relayed to us. Finally, I'd like to thank Sue Wickham, Dominic Banfield, Katja Wilmot, Sarah Hayward and others from the Academy who've helped organising this, and the fellows who comprised the organising committee of the symposium. Without the effort of all of the staff of the Academy that put into it, this certainly wouldn't have run as smoothly as we expect it will. So without further ado, I will introduce our first speaker, who is Chloe Munro. And Chloe is well known to a number of you. I won't go through her bio in detail, but she came to Victoria in 1966 to lead the Victorian government's energy reform process, where a lot of this reform actually started across the nation. She was also Secretary of Natural Resources and Environment in the government. She's Commissioner of, or serving 8 years as Commissioner and Chair of the National Water Commission. And as you're aware, she was a member of the expert panel for the Finkel review. And she's now the inaugural chair of the Clean Energy Regulator, the independent statutory authority established to administer Australia's climate change legislation. So, Chloe. And Chloe is going to address us on an overview of, overview of the independent review of the future security of the NEM.
Well, thank you very much for that introduction, David. And I was the inaugural chair of the Clean Energy Regulator, but after 5 years I stepped down from that. So now I'm a bit of a free agent, which is wonderful, although I have been appointed to chair the expert panel, which is working with the AEMO to work on their approach to implementing the recommendations of the Finkel review, and that's very satisfying. And in fact, coming here today, it's one of a series of engagements I've had to speak about the review, and it was so much work. It's wonderful that there is continuing interest in what we did and what we said, because quite often reports like this end up on the shelf, and that really isn't the case with this work. And I think I'd like to start really by paying tribute to Alan Finkel himself. It was a fantastic choice. You can't imagine really many other people being able to do what he did, to come from pretty much a blank sheet. He really was a tabula rasa when it came to the national electricity market, to absorbing everything that we learned and being able to integrate that, and of course bringing a very fine, sceptical, scientific mind to the whole thing, which was very helpful indeed. No baggage, no preconceptions, but a lot of very clear thinking. Of course, Dr. Finkel was the president of the Academy and snatched from here to become chief scientist, and I'm delighted to see the current president, Hugh Bradlow, here today, who I think brings particular, and I know Hugh from my days at Telstra, brings particular expertise, which is again very topical and very current in the digital sphere, which is really certainly where many of the solutions, I think at least, lie for the energy future. So thank you for joining us today, Hugh, and more generally, thank you everybody for coming and listening to what I have to say. So what I plan to do is give a bit of a snapshot of the review and try and just give you a very high-level view of our thinking and draw out some of the points that are more relevant to Victoria in its current situation. But I think it's important in terms of how we thought about it. One of the main features of the review was, and it might be criticised for being excessively pragmatic, but our approach was to start from where we are and to draw on work that was already underway excuse me, under the aegis of the COAG Energy Council, and as far as possible build on that. So it was a blueprint for the future, building on existing foundations rather than a complete redesign from the ground up. And I think that's one of the reasons why it has been well accepted very broadly across the industry, because it did have that practical focus. Oops, there we go. So if the report is deficient in any way, I would have to say it's not for lack of input. It was quite extraordinary how much help we had, and in fact I'm sure that many people here today contributed in one way or another, and so I would like to thank everybody for engaging so constructively with the work that we had to do. And we also benefited very much from international experience, and one thing that was absolutely clear was that a transformation of the energy system is underway everywhere. It's irreversible. It's happening for very good reasons. It will be to the benefit of consumers. But the way is quite rocky in a lot of places. And so the kind of challenges that we are facing here to maintain system performance while integrating new technologies and particularly the increasingly distributed resources, that challenge is not special to Australia. In terms of reference of the review, asked us to look at 4 outcomes. Security, reliability, what I characterise as affordability, although that's quite a difficult word, and meeting our Paris commitments. And as the review title implies, at first the highest priority was security. And we were told that in no uncertain terms when we set out. And it was precipitated by the system black that was experienced in South Australia just about exactly a year ago, actually, which you would all remember, and I'm sure most of you have read a lot of the coverage of the analysis after the event of why it happened. There were certainly many learnings from it, and I think one thing you could say is that the extent and duration of it, at least, was the result of a cascading series of failures. There wasn't just one single factor sitting behind it. But when we started consulting, it became very clear that and we went first to South Australia, not surprisingly, I met with a lot of businesses there. Well, the thing that actually took me aback a little bit was just the depth of anxiety about the outlook for energy prices. It wasn't just that businesses had already faced unprecedented increases in their power and gas bills, but it was that they couldn't see the end of it, and in some cases they couldn't secure contracts for the energy they needed, at least not on terms they thought would be tolerable. And as we've seen, household energy bills have also become a very potent political topic. So affordability really became the top priority, and I think in lots of ways that really is the one that intermittently security and reliability come to the top, but affordability is an ongoing theme at the moment. So our review was mainly concerned with the wholesale market, and we were grateful that other reviews were underway that could dig into the vexed question of the effectiveness or otherwise of retail competition, for example. So here in Victoria, since the Finkel report was handed down, the review commissioned by the Victorian Government has been delivered, and the Government's considering their response. And the ACCC has also been commissioned to look at this, and they'll report in June next year. But we've already heard from Rod Sims in his press club speech last week some of his preliminary thinking, and some of it is quite, when you add the two together, some quite radical views about what will need to be done. So it'll be interesting to see how all that plays out. Now, getting to the topic of today's seminar, of course, within a month of starting the review, the closure of Hazelwood was announced, and that threw the question of reliability into really sharp relief. It wasn't a surprise that Hazelwood was going to close, but of course the timing of it was a shock. And as Rod Sims pointed out last week, the impact would have been quite different if, as many people had expected, the Portland smelter had also been slated to close. But of course the rescue package that had been put in place changed the dynamics, particularly in the Victorian market, quite considerably. So even before Hazelwood had closed, we had a taste of things to come with the outages, the forced outages that happened in February this year with involuntary load shedding in New South Wales and South Australia. And I think this was a real test of the national nature of the national electricity market, setting aside the West, because it was pretty clear that the Victorian Government took a dim view of the possibility that Victorian customers might be blacked out in order to keep other customers online in other states. And I think this is one of the political challenges associated with the nature of this market. But more generally, what had happened really was that the NEM lurched from a situation of oversupply, often blamed on the renewable energy target with prices quite depressed, to serious concerns about supply adequacy and escalating wholesale prices, which obviously are exacerbated by gas supply issues. But I think the important point of this slide is that the system can't be secure if it's not reliable, and that means that new investment needs to be made. And the question for investors is, on what terms? And they need to know, in order to invest, how the electricity sector is going to be expected to contribute to Australia's emissions reduction objectives, and on what terms that will be done. And absent that, they're going to build in some pretty hefty risk premia, and that's going to increase cost. So when you look at it like that, you'd see the four outcomes. It's not so much that they're competing, which people often talk about. They're actually intimately connected and interdependent. And so the approach that we took was really about optimising across all four. So what with that background, what we concluded was the famous 50 recommendations, and they're organised around things that tackle the four outcomes pretty directly. Some of those are regulatory measures, if you like, set the performance standards for the system, but also building then on three sort of whole of system pillars. So we had four outcomes and three pillars. And again, our thinking was very much treating the electricity sector as a system, not just focusing on the generation or supply-demand balance, for example, or the networks, but the system as a whole. And very critically, the system includes customers. We also took an approach that focused on the outcomes and not the inputs. So the features like whether there's what the percentage of renewables ultimately is in the mix, or even is there a competitive retail market, those are means to an end. They're not ends in themselves. When we said we're technology neutral, this wasn't just about generation and fuel types, because demand-side management, storage, network investments, they're resources too. And I must say I do like the way that increasingly AEMO is talking in the language of resources, not just focusing on generation, for example, and I think that's very important. So it's a package, because the outcomes depend on the performance of the system as a whole. So just talking about some of our recommendations, we recommended imposing obligations that go to both energy security and reliability. So on security, for example, requiring transmission network service providers to maintain a sufficient level of inertia for each region or sub-region. And a portion of that, of course, could be substituted by fast frequency response services. So it might be capital investment, it might be some other kind of service model. And also that new generators that connect to the system might be required to have fast frequency response capability. We think that's a low-cost measure and probably more easily done that way than trying to build a new market for fast frequency response, but that's obviously something that could be on the table for later. We recommended a very strengthened approach to risk management for security, and particularly that some of that should be systemic assessments by the Council of Australian Governments, and they should be looking at cybersecurity because this is very highly networked and therefore intrinsically has some vulnerabilities, and of course extreme weather events, as we'd already seen. We also recommended that that there might be reliability obligations on new generators that connect to the system. And I'd emphasise here that in both cases, the level at which those obligations are set, or if they are actually required at all, very much depends on a regional assessment that would need to be done by the market operator and needs to be set very dynamically, because in lots of circumstances, if the right interventions are made elsewhere in the system, then you wouldn't actually need to impose those obligations. So it really is something that has to be assessed to see whether it's necessary. And this is very important because within that regulatory framework, what you're then trying to do is to make sure that the market can make the best decisions and deliver whatever the outcome is in the most economically efficient way. But first of all, you have to set your performance standards. Now, speaking of reliability, I might just move on to just come back to Victoria for a second. This is my favourite app. I have a tendency to say virtually anything. I have an app for that. I have a Spirit Level on my phone. I love it. But I also love this one, which is Pocket NEM. And it's it shows live what is happening. This is a screenshot, so I had to put in little wide arrows to show the direction in which those circles are moving. It shows how much electricity is moving between the regions, and it also shows the price. And I put this up, really, it's not a moment that's particularly significant. In fact, the prices are quite low on this particular screen. Tony's nodding to say we're in a different story. But quite typically, when you look at this, what you'll see is that Victoria is a net importer of energy, whereas, of course, before the closure of Hazelwood, we were very much a net importer. So that has implications for the Victorian economy, but also has implications for reliability here. Now, one of the things that we recommended to improve reliability, and particularly recognising the tightness that was emerging across Australia, was that the AEMC, the Australian Electricity Market Commission, which basically writes the rules, should investigate whether there needs to be a strategic reserve. This would be quite a new thing. And in fact, this was what was recommended in AEMO's recent reliability report to the government. I must say what happened thereafter slightly misrepresented what they said, in my view, and there's a bit of a tale to tell. I shan't go into that now, but it has had an impact on, certainly had an impact on investment intentions. But the point is clear that it's not a point you might want to have come to, but if the market has been so constrained by uncertainty, it might be necessary for the system operator to take an intervention to procure, at least for the short term, some additional reserves that would be very much there as a last resort. So designing that is quite tricky. So we recommend that was investigated, and AEMO has definitely said they think they'll need that, and that would apply as much in Victoria as anywhere else. And I think the other thing that I'd like to draw out from this is that one question that emerged very clearly in our analysis is the extent to which the national electricity market really is a fully integrated system across the entire geography that it serves. I've already talked about the political issues that arise, and we can't just wish those away. This is genuine. For governments, if customers in their region are constrained off if load is shed involuntarily in order to protect some other region, this is a very difficult thing for governments to manage. But in any case, what's quite clear is that the security issues occur most when regions are islanded, when they separate. And one of the reasons they separate, of course, could be because, for whatever reason, the interconnect is constrained or possibly unavailable at all. And these are very expensive pieces of equipment to duplicate, to build in the redundancy you might want just for the sake of security. If you build in the additional interconnection and it's used regularly for trade, that's fine. But if it's just sitting there waiting for an event, that's a very expensive interconnect. So the question about how connected regions are and will be in the future is a really big one, particularly in the presence of increasing distributed resources, where a lot of the investment's actually happening at the distribution scale and also behind the meter. The same issue, well, kind of the obverse of that issue occurs with reliability. Reliability is at its best when energy can be traded freely across borders, but that will only happen if there's real demand for that, and if there's a lot of self-sufficiency in the individual regions, of course, you'll see less of that. So I'm going to point, I'm not going to go through all of this in detail because David will tell me I'm out of time, but I did just want to point you, there is quite a lot of analysis and modelling in the reports, and you know, modelling is always questionable. It's all dependent on the shape of the model and the assumptions, which very quickly become invalid, but I just wanted to whip through a couple of things. The first thing is that what we modelled was the, if you like, the vanilla trajectory, 26 to 28% reduction by 2030, and then trending towards net zero emissions later in the century. And you might well argue that the electricity sector could and should do more, but that wasn't the platform we started with, because as Tony Wood, who will speak later today, has said, this is already quite a tough ask for the electricity sector even to deliver this. And the main reason that we did the modelling was to make sure that we could be confident that if the energy mix that came out at the end of that would not compromise reliability and security. And so one of the outputs was this chart, which you can find in our report, which shows the energy mix. And interestingly, you'll see that in the clean energy target, you probably can't read the three columns there show business as usual as the first column. The second column is clean energy target, and the third column is emissions intensity scheme, and it's 2020, 2030, and 2050. And it shows the energy mix. And interestingly, brown coal does a little bit better under emissions intensity scheme, under the clean energy target, mainly because it isn't being penalised for its emissions intensity relative to black coal. And the other thing I think you'll see in that last group of bars is how much gas is required in the business as usual scenario. And of course, one of the questions is whether gas would be available and at what price. So it's one of the risks associated with this. But we asked the Melbourne Energy Institute to do an assessment of the impact on security and reliability, and their report to us was quite reassuring. A more ambitious drive would need to be reassessed. I think that's fair enough. We also looked at the impact on tariffs. You can see they don't come down wildly, and there is a bit of a spread between the different things in our models. And there's also some assessment of regional pricing. Not surprisingly, what you see here is that, given this takes into account moving from being an importer from an exporter to an importer, Victoria goes from being towards the bottom of the pack in terms of wholesale prices to being at the top later in the century. So it's another of the implications post-Hazelwood, I think. But again, an awful lot can change with the investment that takes place. So what we recommended to address this was orderly transition and system planning. And I think one of the things that's really striking internationally is, even though they were facing the same issues, everywhere else seemed to have a plan of how to manage this transition. And we basically have a philosophy that says the market will sort it out. And the truth is that the motivation of the market is not the same as the motivation of the community as a whole, or the governments that represent them, or indeed should be the motivation of the system operator and the regulators of this. And I think we can see this in the approach that you might take to risk around reliability, where the reliability standard is an average kind of smeared across the whole year and the whole market. But actually what you worry about is particular incidents that cause particular strain to particular groups of customers at particular times, and that's quite a different proposition in terms of how you assess that risk. And we might want to talk about that a bit more, but I think it's one of the big challenges for the market operator. I did want to just emphasise that there is actually a lot going on. So I think you're all aware, governments, both collectively and the Cabinet of the Australian Government, have actually accepted 49 of our 50 recommendations, and there's a lot in that. But the 50th is pretty important too, because that includes the three elements: notice of closure, the recommendation that owners of power stations should give at least 3 years' notice of closure, as indeed AGL did. having a known trajectory that governments are aiming for so that industry can understand what it's expected to achieve, and then of course a clean energy target or something similar that is the regulatory instrument by which government procures that, and all three are important. So, but nevertheless, even without that, a lot can happen. We're seeing the states taking action, and I have to say, out of those, Victoria is one. It's focusing very much on its renewables strategy. And this may sound cynical of me, but at least the states have a plan. Now, whether all of those plans add up to a national plan is another story, but it is something that's missing still at a national level, and we hope that the work of the Energy Security Board will tie all that together and will have a more coherent national approach. And thirdly, AEMO has certainly been taking a lot of action preparing for the coming summer. And, you know, you've seen all the reports, and particularly the reliability report, which was presented just earlier this month, and there's been a lot of follow-up to that. But the procurement of a strategic reserve effectively for this coming summer has been a very important step. It doesn't guarantee 100% that there will be no reliability problems, but we're certainly in a much different state and a much better state than we would have been without it. So I'll close there, but just to point you, if you haven't read the report, it's there. You can find it on the Department of Environment and Energy's website with the supporting material, including the Jacobs modelling and the Melbourne Energy Institute report. I think it all adds up to a pretty good read. I'm very pleased, I must say. The reception of the report is still very much just, you know, 99% of people who speak to me who've read it say it was a good report and it can do the job, and it's immensely satisfying to be in that position. As I said from the previous three slides, you can say there is actually a lot of action taking place to implement at least the 49 recommendations, and we just hold our breath to see what happens next on the 50th. Thank you very much, everyone.
All right, our next speaker is Paul Graham, and Paul is the Chief Economist Energy for CSIRO. He's been with CSIRO for a number of years, 17 years now. Prior to that, he was with ABARE as a commodity analyst and researcher. He's worked with innumerable companies, and when I was chief of the division, I can remember Paul working with many, many companies, putting reports together for government and others. So he's very knowledgeable in this area of cost and greenhouse gas intensity of future industry, of future technology. So, Paul, over to you.
Thanks. Yeah, this is starts off a little bit off topic from what we've just been talking about, but what I'm going to do is circle back to what is the cost of that reliability that we've been talking about. So first I want to talk about cost projections and cost projection methodologies. We've used a lot in Australia at different points of time. Sometimes we've just used the black box approach where we commission someone and we're not quite sure how they came up with it, but we get them. But generally there's the four ways. You can do expert surveys, sometimes that's called a Delphi survey. You can do essentially historical extrapolation, so you have a relationship with time. You can do bottom-up engineering studies where you essentially try and track every nut and bolt and really understand what are the components and the cost of each component. And if you change components, then what is the new cost of that? And that's a very sort of more physical and scientific-based approach. And more recently, a lot of people have been using this learning by doing idea, which is a very old idea, which was sort of founded in World War II airplane manufacturers, the oldest reference I can find, where you sort of see for each unit that you produce, you generally get, for each doubling of the units that you produce, you get a certain percentage cost reduction. So it's irrespective of time, it's as a function of production of units, if you like. The problem with the expert surveys is you don't really know what people are responding, what their opinion's based on, so it's a bit more subjective. The problem with extrapolating over time is sometimes technologies move outside of time, so sometimes they do nothing. They don't improve at all over time, or sometimes they improve very rapidly, almost outside of time in that sense. So 50% cost reductions in a year, that's never going to be able to predict that. The bottom-up engineering studies are very expensive, so you generally can only do one technology at a time, and you need a really big team around that. Learning by doing is reasonably cost-effective and fixes some of those issues, but it's quite computationally expensive. You need to project both the uptake and the costs at the same time. So lots of pros and cons, which is why we use a bit of a combination at CSIRO. So for mature technologies, we think it is appropriate just to extrapolate things because the mature technologies do tend to move reasonably in step with time. We will do bottom-up engineering studies for very specific things, and certainly around our solar thermal work that we do, we really do want to know if we change this component of the power station, will that change the cost by how much? We want to make sure that the research we're doing on certain things, we know what cost reduction will lead to. So sometimes we do in-depth bottom-up stuff, but we have in recent years developed a global and local learning model, which is a model of the global electricity sector. We did that because we want to be able to track some of these faster moving technologies as well. So we actually did that for the first time in 2011. So the advantage of being around for a while is you can dip back into history. And so this is 6 years ago. And we did end up using that model for the Australian Energy Technology Assessment process and for the more recent 2015 power generation technology study. The model structure's out there, it's transparent. And we use the outputs for all of the electricity modelling studies that we've been doing over the last few years. Recent updates, we added storage because of course storage is becoming much more important. Part of the learning there was that we actually decided we need to model not just the whole global electricity sector but the whole global transport sector, because all of the learning for storage is actually coming, well, not all of it, but a significant amount of it is coming from the transport sector and impacting the electricity sector. We've expanded how many countries we track now, about 13 different regions, and we've been updating our understanding. Particularly what you want to understand about other countries is how much renewable resources have they got, because that really determines how much are they going to dip into renewables to meet their requirements versus other options. So our approach is based on what other people do. The IEA are most well known for their survey. Jacobs, who did the Finkel modelling, and tend to use more of the extrapolation approach. So they have a de-escalation factor. You'll see in most of their tables for their costs, that's a de-escalation factor over time. US DOE probably do the most sort of bottom-up engineering work. Ourselves, DOE also have a global local learning model, and Bloomberg New Energy Finance also as well. So there's other people using these approaches. I'd have to say all of them have failed around solar and storage. So no one's been able to project, no one really can project when a technology is halving its costs in a year, doing that type of huge cost reduction. But arguably, I think you could say that learning by doing has been the least worst, because that is a technology, that is a learning approach, so it can get big chunks of cost reduction in a single year, 20, 30%, but 50% is very hard to build in. I do worry about what is the ultimate floor for solar. So where does the learning curve run out? This is when you look at it and plot it from the 1970s to now, you would have said 10 years ago it can't possibly get any cheaper, but it still keeps getting cheaper. So I think we're probably ready to do some sort of bottom-up, how much sand and steel, how cheap can this actually get? I think to find out the floor for solar PV. And just recently, just to show that there can't be any more shocking technologies out there, recent analysis said that wind has just had offshore wind has just had a 50% cost reduction in 2 years. So there's still technologies surprising us. So this is still a very fraught area and a very sort of thankless task, to be honest, because anyone who's putting out projections is going to get some stuff wrong, and we're probably going to continue to. So this is where we stand. A bit of historical analysis here, and I appreciate that might be a bit hard to read, but I've tried to gather together. So Jacobs have changed their names over the years. They were MMA, and then they were SKM MMA. and then Jacobs. So Jacobs is all the blue ones. CSIRO is the green ones, and I've put in, we had a big study back in 2009-10, we had a US DOE survey, and EPRI was the study in 2010. So this is the kind of story of where we've gotten to today. So what we generally thought around 2010 was that CCS was reasonably cost competitive with renewables on capital costs sort of standing. But where we've gotten to is we've sort of crept over the last 5, 6, 7 years. We've been really just slowly putting our CCS cost projections up to 2030. Sorry, I should have said these are all 2030 projections. So we haven't been improving our CCS cost projections, but we've been reducing the costs of wind and solar. Unfortunately, in 2011, SKM MMA got it quite wrong, and unfortunately that was the cost that we put in for the Clean Energy Future. The last time Australia did a big greenhouse gas modelling projection, we were still saying solar in 2030 was going to be $6,000 a kilowatt. We're now sort of down at $1,000 a kilowatt by 2030. But for the Finkel review, we're quite in step with Jacobs. If you look at wind, CSIRO on wind, our original 2011 projection, we're actually still pretty much on par with that with our recent 2017 update. I would say with solar thermal that we still really have no idea. It's moved around, it's gone up, it's gone down. I think we're just waiting for people to build them and so we can see what they look like. So I'd say increasing confidence in wind and solar, still probably losing confidence over time for CCS, and very, very uncertain with solar thermal. The point of having a global model is you can actually, because this cost reduction only happens if people build it. That's the fundamental assumption. So you can then look into the model and say, who built this stuff to get that projection? And sort of go and check the different regions and check, do I really believe that that region can use that much solar or that much wind? And you can sort of check. So this is what the sort of modelling adoption looks like at the moment, but it's still a bit preliminary. So we do have regions building Kelly and CCS and gas. We have other regions more leaning towards renewables. But that's the sort of point of having a global model, if you like, tracking where that cost reduction is going to occur. So for 2030, using our most updated analysis, we sort of end up with brown coal and black coal CCS just a bit above $120 a megawatt hour. And we're looking at wind and PV more in that sort of $50, $60 a megawatt hour in 2030. And solar thermal, a bit more uncertainty around just around 100. So the first thing you think about when you see that is, of course, that's all rubbish because that's those renewables aren't firmed, so you can't even really compare them. I totally agree, and we've had some opportunities in the last couple of years to really get at this question of what does it cost to firm renewables. And so we had the Electricity Network Transformation Roadmap and the Low Emissions Technology Roadmap, where we were sort of forced by circumstances to model really high variable renewable scenarios. And we wanted to make sure if we're going to put that out there as a plausible future that would actually be a reliable scenario. So here's how we sort of tried to convince ourselves about what would be needed. We did a lot of this modelling. You're going to see a lot of these diagrams for the next decade. This is how you convince yourself that you've actually met demand. So this is like a really extreme day in New South Wales in 2045, charging up storage from solar and wind, using a bit of storage and wind and gas at night, that sort of solution. Sometimes you're spilling a lot of power. Question is, how much storage is that? How much gas is that? How much loss of capacity factor is associated with that? All these things add to the costs of variable renewables. And when do you need it? When do you have to start building all of those things? Because what we know now is in most systems, setting aside South Australia, you could add renewables at no cost. There's plenty of flexible capacity there already. When do you have to start adding more flexible capacity? And what our modelling was saying in this sort of messy diagram essentially you have to start adding more storage once you're getting in that sort of 40 to 50% variable renewable range. And then it's fairly flat for a while, and then it gets quite non-linear if you want to go towards sort of 80-90% variable renewables. And so this is what we're sort of using to try and figure out how much storage we needed. The scale I'm using there is to say you need, by the end of that, about 0.75 kilowatts of batteries, in this case, was what we were modelling, for every kilowatt of variable renewables. Another way of saying that, it's the same data just expressed differently, is that you need about 8 hours storage at average state load if you've got a very, very, very high variable renewables state. So there's another different ways of looking at it, depending what you can get your head around. So we put that into the modelling, and we made sure we were costing all that correctly. But models don't necessarily, you need to sort of pull it back out so you can understand it. If we pull these requirements back out to see what they look like, as I said, it's about 8 hours storage at average state load, or 0.75 kilowatts per kilowatt of variable renewables. We also needed a lot of gas capacity to be there as well, because once the 8 hours have run out, if you've got a low wind, low sun week, you're really going to have to go to some more standing traditional peaking capacity, or gas. In this case, we're using gas, dispatchable gas open cycle. That would come on for about 5% of the year, so it's a very low capacity factor. It would just come on during those low sun, low wind days or weeks. We had to add synchronous condensers because a lot of the time this system is operating with very, very low inertia. And we had to count for the loss of the capacity factor. So there's a lot of spilling of energy going on in this system, where, particularly in summer, you simply can't use all the solar energy that's available. But you still need to build that solar energy for the diversity and for winter. So if you try and stack that all up, it looks something like this. You've got your basic, and this goes back to 2015, so the timing doesn't suit with 2017 costs, but we start off with just the cost of variable renewables. You initially don't need to add anything if you're starting off with about a 10% variable renewable share, but over time you're finding you'll get curtailed, so you start to lose capacity factor as you add more variable renewables. Then you'll have to add all these other firmware around them, batteries. You'll keep degrading your capacity factor. You need to add open cycle gas. So you're adding all this equipment around the variable renewables so that the system can stay reliable. And it sort of builds up to this cost over time because you're increasing the percentage of renewables over time. And it actually comes back to something like about $120 a megawatt hour. So if you go back to our original sort of LCOE, we're sort of back to saying, well, this looks about the same cost as other options like CCS. But the sort of the tension that we're having around this is, however, right now, systems and states which have plenty of flexible generation, their current cost is more like $60, $80 a megawatt hour. And they can drop into that system. They don't impose any costs right now. So we're sort of caught between this: are we designing a system for the long term and wondering what that costs, or are we designing a system for what it costs now? So that's where the tension is, I think, around this question of reliability and variable renewables. So I'm just going to wrap up just on a short note on greenhouse gas intensity. Obviously, renewables and CCS, those long-term solutions, are very low greenhouse gas intensity. But what we're sort of having a debate about more recently is what should we fund to build now in terms of greenhouse gas intensity. This is a new gas or coal plant. New brown coal plant is around 1 tonne per megawatt hour. New black coal plant around 0.8. And in the spectrum for gas from sort of open cycle right up to combined cycle, which is more towards 50% efficiency, they're in that sort of 0.4 to 0.6 tonnes per megawatt hour range. So that's where, when people are talking about that and about where things should be set, these are the choices. All right, I'll finish there. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. Could I ask our three speakers now to come up and perch themselves on these chairs, please? We've got a session of discussion now. There may be some questions that come in, as I said at the outset, from fellows interstate, and they will be relayed to us as they come up. Could I ask you to, when you've got a question, state your name and affiliation, please? So, have we got any questions at the moment?
Ben Potter from the Australian Financial Review. It's a question for Mark Sanford. Damien Sanford, beg your pardon. Yesterday's reappraisal of the gas shortage situation, I was just curious to know what that means for this summer's projected 950 megawatt potential shortfall on a very extreme day. And you talked about the ARENA, the ARENA-sponsored demand response tender. I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit about I think the RERT is for a much larger amount of energy, and it looks like it's going to be satisfied by largely by a combination of demand response and some other sort of demand management or efficiency measures. I wonder if you could kind of outline that for us. Thanks very much.
Sure, thanks, Ben. So the figures that were yesterday in our GC, they're actually a consumption, not a peak day issue. So it's an annualised consumption shortfall. If you have a look at what drives that, a long-term outage of a large coal-fired power station now with that 5 gigawatts missing that I previously mentioned would mean that the bulk of that is either picked up in additional capacity from your black coal units, which a number of those, and published in the paper recently, have been quite stretched or operating at higher capacity factors, or in the short term will be picked up by gas-fired units that have traditionally operated as peakers but might be operating at a more sustained level, say as a base load. You only have to have a look in the Latrobe Valley this year. There's been a couple of outages of plant down there that has necessitated some of the gas-fired peakers operating for extended periods of time. So that's the dynamics of, I suppose, how the electricity and the gas markets are playing. So it's not a peak day issue, it's a consumption issue on the gas. On the ARENA product, so if you have a look at the way the RERT has traditionally worked, you've taken large chunks of energy, say a pot line at an aluminium smelter, and you've contracted that to come off for fixed periods of time. Obviously, with Hazelwood coming out of the stack and what we've published in the electricity statement of opportunities, we're seeing a greater need than say 2 or 3 or 500 megawatts, and out there this year we're chasing 1,000 megawatts of demand response to, I suppose, bundle up and call our strategic reserve for this summer. The ARENA product is quite innovative, and as the operator, the person responsible with the control rooms under me to manage those risks this year. If you have a look at the 8th of February in South Australia, that was actually a security issue, not a reliability issue that we managed. There's a lot of misinformation out there, which meant that we had to get the system back within its safe operating limits within 30 minutes. Now, a number of the products we've traditionally procured under the reserve have been a longer lead time, hour, 4 hours, or even 24 hours. Under the ARENA product, what we're looking for is a range of different services, and this year we've gone out and procured a 10-minute service, so we can have that activated and either the additional embedded generation up and running or the load reduction within 10 minutes, which for an 8th of February type scenario would potentially have avoided the need to load shed. So quite excited about that new product, and hopefully it delivers the benefits that we've scoped it out to do.
Okay,
Hugh Bradlow from ATSI. I have an overarching question. No one's mentioned nuclear, just wondered why. And secondly, Chloe, you mentioned a 2070 decline to zero emissions. There's a recent Stanford-Berkeley study that says it's feasible in 2050. Were you being overly conservative?
Well, answering the nuclear question first, certainly from the point of view of the Finkel review, we weren't philosophically opposed to nuclear, but we couldn't see that it was a practical option given the state of play in Australia at the moment. And as I said, we started from where we're at. And, we've also had the benefit of the South Australian inquiry, in particular, which questions the economics. And I think when you see the work that CSIRO just presented and the learning curve that's applying in renewables and renewables with firming, it's very hard to see nuclear traversing that same learning curve. So we just didn't think it was helpful to delve into holding out a prospect for nuclear contributing, which isn't to say it might not in the future, but it just really wasn't part of the scenarios we felt were worth considering in this kind of pragmatic start from where we are universe. But it certainly wasn't to do with any kind of philosophical view of it one way or another. I don't think your predecessor would have wanted to sign up to that. So that's nuclear. And I would say it's one reason why perhaps our modelling outcomes look a bit different from some of, for example, the work done by the Climate Change Authority, which makes assumptions about where geothermal might be, biofuels. And again, this was a bit more speculative. So our modelling is conservative about certainly where costs are. And I think perhaps you saw that again from the chart that was shown. So in terms of could or will we be able to reach zero emissions from electricity earlier than 2070? Certainly that's possible. But because we started with a view of, well, let's start from where we are, let's have this kind of vanilla trajectory as the base that we anchor our modelling in, that doesn't take you that far that fast. It would take, certainly as from where we stand now, it would take some concerted commitment, I think, to get there. And that's not the world we're in at the moment. The other thing about heading so rapidly towards 2050 is an awful lot of this depends on what happens on the demand side. And that there is obviously huge opportunity for reducing emissions simply by greater efficiency of how energy is used across the economy. But at the same time, were you to embark on electrification, you would get emissions reduction of transport, which is a very attractive proposition for lots of reasons. You'd get emissions reduction happening faster across the economy as a whole, but not within the electricity sector itself. So that's another sort of question to sort of bear in mind when you think about the interaction between what policy settings are for electricity and for the whole of the economy.
Yes, certainly we include nuclear in the global model, and we build in the plans of different countries, and it gets a bit of cost reduction over time, not as fast as others. There is a bit of it. There's always a tension in our model around, should we have a separate category for different, the more advanced nuclear products, and maybe they'll move a bit quicker. But it tends to be something that almost operates for me outside of economics anyway. It seems to be a sort of government choice around whether a country has nuclear and how much nuclear it has. But I mean, it's certainly in the cost range of the other low emission technologies, but as I said, I think it's more of a social and a government choice.
Hello there, Barry Hooper from Uno Technology. With a lot of these comparisons of different technologies in the energy space, there certainly seems to be a lot of apples versus pears comparison, and I'm rather concerned that there needs to be more of a clarity in this, and I'm glad to see in Paul's work there as we need to do, thinking about the 24/7 versus intermittency, and that analysis was great. The other one there I just wanted to address to Paul. The numbers you had there with CCS, and just to be clear, all of those comparisons are new build comparisons, and certainly in the case with existing fossil fuel plants of any sort, retrofitting CCS does drive the cost down by around half, because you're not building your base power plant there. And I'm not sure whether now your model actually is capable of retrofitting, but certainly a lot of the analysis there do change that. And the interesting aspect of that is that with your future firming graph that you put up there, into that space where you can actually confirm or ensure that the CCS is beginning to become a mature technology, it can then start to rely on some learning that might actually change it then through into the 2050s, etc. So just comment there, Paul, could you just confirm that those sorts of cost reductions, at least on capital for retrofitting CCS, are in the ballpark of what I was saying? And finally, I just want to confirm all of those numbers are at the same financing base, aren't they? Because I think a lot of things you see about costing for renewables, etc., are quite different to some of the other technologies. Thank you.
Yeah, same weighted cost of capital, and I know there's been more work recently to try and give different costs of capital to different technologies based on risk, but we haven't done that here. So yeah, retrofitting's always been a problem. It's very difficult to model in certain frameworks, so we still don't do it, which is not ideal. And yes, it is lower cost. The other thing I should say, while I'm sort of self-criticising here, is there's a lot of one of the lessons I got out of the low emissions technology roadmap is there's a lot of other abatement that needs to happen outside the electricity sector where CCS could be quite useful, and we haven't built in that as well. So there could be some co-learning that happens outside the electricity sector which reduces the cost of CCS, even if there's nothing happening in the electricity sector. So yeah, I think there's certainly other opportunities for cost reduction over time, and yeah, we haven't put everything in the circle, unfortunately. Yeah.
I hope I'm not putting Paul Fearon in a difficult position here, but Paul will be talking about CCS cost of capture, and Jane Burton about sequestration potential in Victoria immediately before lunch, and some of these issues could be addressed there. So, another question.
Hervey Carlos from Engineers Australia. Would each of you like to just comment on some of the misinformation that's currently out there at the moment in regards to the energy market in Victoria and possibly across Australia as well?
Where do you start?
3 minutes.
3 minutes. Get myself in a lot of trouble here. Look, I think there is a lot of misinformation, and unfortunately, every week there seems to be a different topic, and even internally, I think the front page of the AFR oscillates between gas and electricity on any given day. I think the debate just needs to be cooled a little bit and some facts put on the table, and hopefully that's what our ESU and our GSU are attempting to do. The system is reliable. We are working hard to keep it that way. Costs are definitely going up, but we are in a transition, and I think as the cost of the new technology comes down, it becomes more dispatchable, storage costs reduce, then I think we'll get through this. But I don't think some of the misinformation is useful in the debate to get us where we need, so that businesses and consumers can continue to use the electricity and the energy that we produce in Australia, because we are an energy superpower, reliably.
Well, I think a lot of the information issues are actually quite similar in other fields to energy. It's just that we're really confronting them. So the two things that strike me are always incredibly difficult to communicate around are, one is risk and probabilities, and the other is large numbers. So, for example, if you talk about the impact of some policy measure, and it's going to be billions of dollars, and you're putting it, those numbers are never put in context. So what do these billions of dollars look like compared to the actual asset value of the entire system that you're enhancing, say? Or what is the impact on GDP compared to a GDP which is measured in the trillions. These are hard, these are difficult to convey well. So I think that is certainly one of the things that's making it a bit febrile from time to time. Risk is even more complicated because, and Damien addressed this very much in his comments earlier, that, you know, on the one hand you're looking at, you know, a measure of reliability, say, which is the 0.002, and that's very abstract, but actually what people experience is, and we saw this in water, you know, when you had the millennial drought and suddenly you're having a 1 in 1,000 year event, and then you have a 1 in 1,000 year event 3 years in a row, you know, and this is really hard for people to understand, but it's those extremes to which a lot is the experience that really hurts and that people respond to. So I think both of those are difficult to communicate well, and mostly we rely on our institutions to insulate us from having to worry about all of that, and the institutions have done a pretty good job, but in a difficult circumstance. And now we're seeing where really quite a large adjustment has to be made in how the institutions manage the system to get back to operating within parameters which people feel comfortable with. And so does the information matter, how it's communicated? Maybe not, but the actions certainly do matter, and some of that's very contestable.
Have any questions coming from any other questions?
Thanks. Neeraj Lal from the Victorian Government and the ANU. My question is to the panel about how you see the evolution of the recently launched DEX platform, not just for demand management, perhaps also for future distributed generation and ancillary or frequency and voltage services.
Well, I might comment on that first, and Hugh will remember when I was working with him at Telstra a very long time ago, and I was briefly Telstra's thought leader on climate change. You know, what we saw then was enormous opportunity for digitisation and activation of investments that had been made by private individuals behind the meter to both reduce their own costs of getting the services they wanted and also reducing emissions. And there were huge barriers to that happening. And what we're seeing now, I think, is that revolution, which certainly I've been quite frustrated hasn't happened in the more than a decade since I left Telstra, beginning to actually bear fruit. And so the DEX platform is one example of that, and you can see there are lots of others. So which ones are going to win out? This is an emerging market, I don't know, in terms of peer-to-peer trading and a whole lot of different things. But this ability to coordinate lots of small, you know, they're very small things happening across the whole web, both on the supply and the demand side, in a way that gives a collective benefit, and then monetize that way so it's worthwhile, and so that people get rewarded for investments that they've made that at the moment they're only kind of doing out of the good of their hearts, frankly. You know, there is a fantastic opportunity there. So some of what the DEX platform is about that, but it's by no means the only product in the market, and some of those entrepreneurial businesses will flourish, and some will find that they've just timed their investment wrong and they don't do so well. But I'm very optimistic it's really going to change the game. It's going to make the job of the market operator quite different, and that's going to be a challenge too, because they can't be all seeing and all knowing. That's quite scary. So how those entities interact, I mean, you might want to comment on that, but it's another of the kind of big questions, is how do you get the right visibility and transparency, and how much control do you really need, and how much can you just rely on everybody doing their thing and it all adds up to a good outcome?
Yeah, I think as Chloe's already pointed out, there's a range of different services and products and platforms that are emerging, and I think the key thing is how do you integrate them into the market to ensure reliability, affordability and security. Automation will be the key for us as a system operator going forward. The complexity is already there in the market, that where you've got a number of operators sitting there, analysing the information that comes in and needing to make an informed and timely decision. We're exceeding the human capacity to be able to make those decisions in some circumstances. So I think automation and integration of these platforms will be key to the future market.
Time for one more question.
John Freeban, University of Melbourne. My question is, do we have the right sort of security and reliability targets? Because they don't come for free, and the technology is sort of changing those things. It's an even more challenging question, I guess, than risk and uncertainty. But it does seem to me there's an assumption we can have absolute security and reliability and it'll cost us nothing. The reality is it costs us a hell of a lot, and it seems to me we should think about the trade-offs.
Well, I mean, of course we do, and in fact one of the recommendations, we touched on it in the Finkel review and it was in the reliability report as well, is that the reliability standard needs to be reviewed and, you know, made probably more kind of sophisticated beast. I mean, I remember here, many of you Victorians will have been around at the time after the Longford tragedy, when the explosion down at the plant, people died, and Victorians were without gas supply for 2 weeks. And what became very obvious then, I think, was that people were actually pretty stoic about it and accepted all of that and the consequences of that, even though there were quite severe consequences in some cases. But what they wouldn't tolerate was that happening again in the near future. And so a lot of these things are not about, we can't tolerate an incident, but what we can't tolerate is the prospect that there are going to be repeated incidents. And that kind of is a different measure, and that should be affordable. You know, having 100% reliability clearly isn't, but some kind of measure about not just being exposed to repeated incidents ought to be more measurable. So I think that's one of the ways through, John. But yeah, it's a challenge, and of course, the point I was making about what's the most important thing moving around is absolutely right. And you can see this more than anywhere with network. And Rod Sims was pointing out, 41% of the increases over whatever period he was looking at was attributable to network charges, arguably gold plating, driven by governments responding to reliability and security issues at the time. And that cost has been, a cost that now people would say, well, we shouldn't willingly have worn that. But at the time, obviously, it was quite different. So it just moved. What's most important moves around those 4 quadrants all the time, and they've just got to be kept integrated.
Yeah, I don't think I can really add much more than other than that the community expectations have moved from probably where those security and reliability standards were set, and a review of those is probably timely. The one thing technology is allowing is consumers and businesses to come into that discussion, though.
Yeah, I'd only add that I think we do need to sort of do that in a reasonably timely way. It could get to the point where we've got investors waiting to know what's the standard. So, yeah, it is something that we need to press on with.
I'm sorry, we don't have time for more questions, so we need to draw this to a close and have morning tea. So could you join me in thanking our 3 speakers?